Hi everyone and welcome to AXA Coral Live. We are coming to you broadcasting from the Carmarby Research Station on the island of Curacao in the Southern Caribbean. It's amazing to have you all with us, and we have, as a quick shout out, fabulous shout out to grades 7 and 8, and they are at W.H. Ballard School, and that is in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. Absolutely fantastic to have you with us, and all the other classes too. Now we have schools from UK, USA, Bermuda, as well as W.H. Ballard and other schools in Canada joining this What is Coral live lesson. My name's Jamie, and I'll be taking you through some basics of coral anatomy in just a bit. But I started off this live lesson by talking about a research station. And what that basically means is a sort of mini university for doing science about the natural world, but close to the environment that we're studying. Now, we're close here at the Carmarby Research Station to the coral reef. And what's wonderful about having a research station is that you have the natural environment you're studying. You can swim out and get some samples, whether it's a coral sample, sponge samples, water samples, but you also have the facilities to analyze that close to where you are. So just behind the camera here, we have a wet lab, and that is where you can have small tanks, small aquaria, and you can put your samples in there and see how they behave. There's also dry labs where you can do a range of experiments looking at the biology and chemistry and indeed the physics of the reef. So we've got just behind us, there is the place where all the air tanks get set up for diving out on the amazing coral reef. Today we are looking at what is coral, and there's a quiz question up on the website. So I know that some of you are watching on YouTube, some of you are watching on the encounteredu.com/live website. So on the Encounter Edu website, there's a quiz question, and you can think about it just now as a class. Is coral A, an animal, B, a vegetable, or C, a mineral? And we'll come to answers in just a bit. But why are we looking at coral? Well, first of all, it is staggeringly beautiful. It forms these amazing underwater shapes. And just around the corner here, and I think we can take you on a brief virtual dive, you can see an area of Elkhorn coral, called Elkhorn because it resembles the horns on an elk. And when you're underwater, it is like being in another world. I think to speak to many of the scientists who work here, whether it's just for a few weeks a year or here full time, it is simply breathtaking. The movement, the life, the abundance, it almost feels like you're in some sort of Disney cartoon. And all that system is the coral reef in play. And so what we're going to look at today is, well, what's that made up of? How does that just appear? So we're going to do that by using a few different things. And this is the incredible edible polyp activity. And you can either do this live, following along with myself, or you can do this at home or in another lesson or an after-school club. All of the instructions are on the live lesson page. For the question and answer session, please do send in your questions. You can use the Slido app, the interaction app on the encounteredu.com webpage for this live lesson, or if you're having issues accessing that, you can also send them directly to info@encounteredu.com. So without further ado, let me introduce you to some of the things that we'll need to make our incredible edible polyp. So first of all, we are going to need a banana or a jumbo marshmallow. Second, we are going to need some biscuits, nice hard biscuits like these ones. You could also use a savory cracker, and in fact a section of cucumber if you wanted this to be a savory edible polyp as well. You're going to need some sort of sticky stuff, whether that's a spread or jam, as I'll be using here. You're going to need some stringy stuff. I've got these strawberry sugar laces here, and you could also use shavings of something like a carrot or bits of pepper or something like that. And last, but by no means least, you're going to need some sugar sprinkles. If you're doing a savory version, chopped herbs are a fantastic alternative. Now, a few little tools you'll need. I've got a plate in front of me, and I'll be doing most of this on the plate here. You'll need a knife for cutting. It doesn't need to be too sharp. A spoon's always useful for the jam. And then also a toothpick is super useful for making some of the holes that we'll be explaining in just a bit. So I'll just give you a minute just to make sure that all students have what they need in front of them, and then we'll make a start. I'm just going to move my place around a bit and get things organized myself. We're going to start with the banana or marshmallow. I'm just going to straighten. My banana seems to have got slightly wonky, so I'm just going to slice a little bit off. And just down on the plate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice a decent section of banana about this big. So that's what I'll be needing to make the incredible edible polyp. I'm just going to take the skin off. Here we go. There we are. So as you can see, it's sort of jumbo marshmallow size as well. And this is going to be the body of our incredible edible polyp. Now I'm just going to see whether any of you have had a chance to reply to that poll. But what we're actually going to find out is that the coral polyp is in fact an animal. I wonder how many of you got that right. So it's an animal related to a jellyfish. So jellyfish going through the water, I think probably most of you have an idea about that. Long tentacles to catch food. Same family, jellyfish, and a sea anemone. So all of you who have seen Finding Nemo will probably be able to relate to the anemone. It's a bit like a jellyfish smushed to the bottom of the sea. And the coral polyp is related to both those. And the first thing we're going to give our coral polyp is a mouth. And I seem to have lost my toothpick, so I'm just going to grab another one. And just on the plate in front of me, I am going to make a mouth for my coral polyp. Here we are, just using a toothpick, putting a mouth in the middle there. Okay. Now, we've had the free-floating jellyfish, but when we're talking about anemones and coral, they're stuck in one place to the sea floor. And we're going to use one of our biscuits or crackers to represent the seafloor. And coral's quite fussy. It can't just settle anywhere. It can't settle on the sand, on the beach just over here, because that moves around too much. It wants a structure or a type of seafloor that's going to be in the same place and not moving around too much. Basically a rocky seafloor, or the rocky bottom of the ocean. I'm going to put that down on my plate next to my coral body. And then to stick the coral polyp to the bottom of the sea, I'm going to use a bit of jam. Well, that's probably too much. I don't know what flavour you got. I've got peach flavoured for today. Can be your pre-lunch snack, depending on where you are, or afternoon if you're watching in Europe. And there we go. So what I've done here is I've stuck the bit of banana, if you're using a marshmallow, whatever, to the sea floor. Now, if you remember, I was just talking about how the coral polyp is related to the jellyfish, or the sea anemone. And so it's going to have some tentacles. And hard corals, the corals we're talking about today, have multiples of 6 tentacles. And so we're going to just put those in now. For the tentacles, I'm going to use, there we go, sections of the strawberry lace. And I'm going to make it easier, and I'm going to use some scissors to cut those sections. In terms of length, about 4 centimeters, 5 centimeters long, about that long. So I'm going to cut 6 of those. So if you're doing this with me, get cutting, and just place them next to the beginnings of your polyp. If you're doing it near a beach, make sure that you don't have any sand on them, because you might eat it later. So just coming back to the plate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the toothpick to make 6 small holes around the outside of the polyp, and that's where the tentacles are going to go. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then I'm just gonna, I always find this a really tricky part of making an incredible edible polyp. And so I'll take my time. Hopefully you won't have the issue of it being tropical where you are and the banana getting mushy. But I'm just gonna, one by one, put the tentacles onto the coral polyp. Oh. Oh, I seem to have got one in the mouth. Please don't try not to do that if you're doing it. It's quite tricky. There we go. There's 4. I reckon we can put another one here. 5. This is the sort of most contorted looking. Oh dear, another one goes in the mouth. But we get the general idea. So what we have here is something that's starting to look a bit more like a sort of anemone. We've got these tentacles coming out of the body. We've got the mouth in the middle. Also, all the sort of waste from eating comes out of the mouth too. A little bit disgusting, things coming in and out of the mouth like that. And what will happen, especially at night, is that the coral polyp will use its tentacles to catch what we call zooplankton. And zooplankton is just a fancy Greek science word for floating animals. And that could be tiny wee crustacea, And crustacea are things like lobsters and crabs, very small ones, things like copepods, so tiny little ones like that. It can be the larvae of bigger animals like crabs, or eggs, all of that small floating animal matter in the ocean caught with these harpoon-like cells on the end of the tentacles and then brought into the mouth. Now, if you're joining us tomorrow, we're very lucky to have Dr. Kristen Marhaver, and we might even be able to feed some baby coral and have a look at what that feeding action, those tentacles taking food into the mouth, looks like in real time. But for now, we're going to focus on our incredible edible polyp. It's got a bit of a problem because if you remember when we looked at the reef over here, swimming along that beautiful Elkhorn Coral, those wonderful clear tropical waters, if the water is clear, it probably means that there isn't that much food in it, because all those little tiny creatures will make it just a little bit cloudy. And this was a problem that stumped one of the great biological scientists, Charles Darwin, on his trip to the Great Barrier Reef over 150 years ago. How can there be so much life in these clear tropical waters? And the answer is that corals came up with this idea. Well, they didn't, because they're not quite like that, but they have this great adaptation where they have basically a vegetable garden living inside them. Technically, it's algae, plant-like algae, and their science name is Susanthelle. And to represent those, if you're doing a sweet version, we've got the sugar sprinkles. If you're doing a savory version, then some chopped fresh herbs would be delicious. So I'm just going to put some of those into my hand and come down to my incredible edible polyp and sprinkle those here. Here we go. I hope you can all see that. Oh, yep. Now these wouldn't be on top, but they'd be inside the tissue, and I'll just put the other ones on the side there. So what that means is that during the day, the algae can use water and carbon dioxide in the water and the power of the sun to create sugars, and that's shared with the polyp, and at night using the tentacles to feed. Now, we have about 1 to 3 out of 10 sort of meals for the coral polyp coming from feeding, and about 7 to 9 out of 10 meals coming from that turbocharging algae inside the coral tissue. Now, looking down here, these amazing adaptation that we have on the reef, one of the problems that the coral polyp's going to have is that there is a potential for predators on the reef to kind of nibble at it. So what the coral polyp does is it takes a mineral. I think I've got a bit of coral reef here. So calcium carbonate, you may know it better as limestone or chalk, takes this mineral that's dissolved in the water and creates a structure. Now, this use of dissolved calcium carbonate, limestone, chalk, isn't just something that coral does. A lot of creatures make shells, some shellfish, or other structures using dissolved minerals in the water. So I'm going to use a second biscuit, this one. I'm going to break it up down here and make essentially what's a corallite, or a calcium carbonate cup, to protect the coral. I'll put another one around here. And here we go. Bring that all round. Obviously need more jam. I'll use a bit more jam to stick this on. There we go. And I'll put more jam on this side. Here we are. So what we have is a rogue tentacle. So I'll just put that back. So just to go over this, we have the coral polyp, an animal related to the sea anemone and jellyfish. It has tentacles to feed, especially at night, but because we see them in these very clear tropical waters, it needs a superpowering food trick, and it does that by having this algae, this plant-like living thing inside its tissue, giving it that turbocharge, and then it's taking the minerals from the ocean water and creating these amazing structures. Now, because coral polyps are tiny wee, often measuring just the size of a pinhead, they do, after they get big enough, split into two and split and split and split and split. And as they split, they're then growing on top of one another, growing and growing and growing this structure. And I'm just going to show you the kind of sort of holes that they might live in. Just find some good coral holes on this bit here. Here we go. I don't know if I've got that sort of zoomed up. So you can see the tiny holes there, and that is where the individual polyps will live. So I hope you've had fun making your incredible edible polyp. We are going to come on to the Q&A section just in a bit. If you are having issues somewhere in terms of submitting questions, don't forget, on the live lesson page with the interaction app, or directly by email at info@encounteredu.com. Those will come through to me. I'm very much looking forward to answering them in just a bit. But before we get there, I'm going to have a taste of my incredible edible polyp, and I encourage you to do so too. Delicious-ish. Very sweet. I think we're going to have to try the savoury one next year, but you probably delicious. So let's come on to your questions. I'll just open that up. Aussie, great question coming straight up. What species feed off coral? Really, really cool question. So there are some specialist, what we call coralivores, those specialist animals that feed off coral. One of the problem ones, if there's too many of them, is the crown of thorns starfish, and you hear of outbreaks on the Great Barrier Reef. Very amazing, beautiful looking, spiky, sort of blue, purple, black starfish, and they sort of cover over the coral, eject some kind of digestive juices, which almost melts the coral and then sort of sucks that back up into them. You also get some fish species will scrape the coral. Perhaps one of the best known, best known of these is the parrotfish. So parrotfish, amazing sort of parrot-shaped beaks, and they use that to scrape the surface of the coral, also scrape algae off various parts of the coral reef. But Aussie, great question, and those are just a couple examples of species that eat coral. Cloverly Primary would like to know, is coral poisonous? Well, obviously not to those species, the parrotfish and the crown of thorns starfish, but I wouldn't recommend eating it yourself, and definitely wouldn't recommend, in fact, harming any coral. It's such a stunningly beautiful part of our natural world that we should do everything we can to protect it. Philippa Wonderful question. How does the coral get its shape? Philippa, I wish I had some plasticine with me because coral grows in different ways depending on where it is and depending on where it is on the reef. So if you can imagine a reef, you've got a shallow bit and then it starts sloping down further, and you've got the waves coming in this way. Very often you get species that look like trees growing sort of like near the reef crest. You get sort of boulders in the lagoon, shaped like trees. You get boulders. You get ones that look like brains. You get encrusting coral, which form a very thin layer of coral over rocks. And I was just, in fact, speaking to one of the researchers here, Rene, this morning, and he's studying plate corals. And very often you get these huge plate corals, and they're slightly deeper on the reef, and they have this plate-like structure, almost like a solar panel. Because they're deeper, there's less light coming through to them, so they need, for the photosynthesis, for the algae to be happy, they need that sort of almost solar panel-like structure. So lots of different shapes, and it's just because different coral species have adapted to different parts of the reef. The reef isn't just a single habitat. You have the reef flat, the reef crest. Reef flat sort of like coming up from the beach up to the edge. Reef crest, where that comes before dropping off with the fore reef that gets the full force of the ocean action, and then the reef slope down to the deep. Elliot, great question. Does the Mariana Trench have coral? I'm not sure about the whole of the Marianas Trench. Certainly I don't think there's any coral in the Challenger Deep, and that's the deepest point of the Mariana Trench. But you do get coral in the deep ocean. It is not the sort of photosynthesizing coral that we've been talking about. The typical coral you might think of when you watch Finding Nemo. It's normally much deeper coral, so there's no light for it to photosynthesize. But yeah, you do get, and they're incredibly long-lived as well, living for thousands and thousands of years. So you do get deep coral, but I don't know specifically whether it can get down all the way to the Marianas Trench. It's a huge trench area, and I'm not quite sure of also of the depth, the shallowest point in it. Elliot, another great question here. Does coral move? There's a science word for living things that don't move, which is sessile. So sessile is a living thing that's stuck in one place, especially an animal. So most corals are sessile. They stick in one place and they grow these amazing structures. They can't sort of they almost glue themselves on and then use all this calcium carbonate in the water to grow these structures. They don't move. There is one type of coral, the mushroom coral, single polyp, that does move. So there is one type of hard coral that does move. From Kirk Newton Primary, it's an awesome question. Why do fish live in coral? Okay, so everyone at Kirk Newton, I want you to imagine that you're a small fish just feeding around the reef, maybe like a sort of bluehead wrasse or something sort of that you might find here, and that there's a predator around, like a grouper or a shark. Now you can just be in this open ocean where there's nowhere to hide, absolutely nowhere to hide, and you'd probably be lunch fairly quickly. Or you could have this amazing three-dimensional space where even if you're like a juvenile or like a kid fish, you've got places to hide, places you can hang out, places to tuck yourself away from predators, especially at night. One of the cool things that the parrotfish does is that it creates a mucus, basically snot, sleeping bag for itself. And that means even when it's hidden, the scent of the parrotfish doesn't get out and attract predators when it's asleep on the reef. So it's an amazing three-dimensional space. There's safety, there's food, there's a whole load of different animals living there, and that's what makes the coral reef so special. In fact, covering just a tiny fraction of the world's ocean, but supporting, I think it's about 25%, a quarter of all marine species. Really, really lovely question. We have here, are there corals in the UK? I'm not sure who that question's from, but it's a great question. One of the most famous reefs in the UK is called the Mingulay Reef. That's Mingulay off the west coast of Scotland. So you will find coral and coral reefs and different reefs around the world, but they're not the tropical coral reefs that you sort of think of when we're studying reefs at the moment. This sort of like shallow photosynthesizing reef with a turbocharged algae you're finding in the tropics. So those are the zones either side of the equator. Because these coral polyps, they're pretty fussy and they're like a nice, stable, warm ocean temperature. Next one, how is coral born? It's a great question, Tyler. So coral is born in two main ways. You have what is called broadcast. So broadcast is when at a certain phase of the moon that the male and female coral animals will put the necessary eggs and sperm into the water, and those will fertilize in the water and almost immediately start to divide and develop into larvae. Larvae, if that's sort of like the sort of tadpole or caterpillar stage of an animal, just in case you want that term explained. And then that larva will settle on the reef and start to develop into an adult coral. The second one is brooding, which I'm not so familiar with, and where that meeting of the egg and the sperm happens within the coral, and then that larva is then released into the open ocean to find its own place to live. But really, really great question. Next up, Myla, great question. Would like to know how much coral is in the ocean. As I mentioned, Myla, it's sort of less than 1% of the ocean is coral reef. I think there are about 600 odd species of hard coral, tropical coral. Most of those found in the Coral Triangle, that's in Southeast Asia, and on the Great Barrier Reef. That's where most coral species are found. And then over here in Curacao, we have about 60, 70 species of hard coral. There's a great question from Union Point Academy, and that's, are the transplanted corals taking well and surviving? That's a really great question. So here there is work being done by a number of scientists looking at bringing the coral babies basically into the lab, supporting them during their early days, getting nice bits of calcium carbonate for them to settle on, settling them on a sort of like a artificial ocean floor, and then planting them back on the reef. That work's been really successful, and we'll hear directly from some of the scientists who are doing that work, both tomorrow with Christian, and then later in the week, and next week with Kelly and Valerie. So very much looking forward to that, and it's an absolutely great question. And they'll give you actually more details on how taking the coral and putting them back up onto the reef, back out onto the reef, is going, how that work's going. What is your favorite species of coral? I think there's probably two. There's a sort of, basically a sort of what's known as a brain corals, or several brain corals. What's great about them is that when you're swimming around them, it looks like someone's just dropped a whole bunch of fossilized big brains on the ocean floor. So those are very, very cool to look at. And they're very numerous just around where we are at the moment. And then, of course, the Elkhorn Coral, and hopefully getting even bigger, growing, being healthy year to year. And then it's like being in an underwater forest, just from the shapes that they make. So that is super, super cool and really lovely. I'm laughing here because I've got what do coral drink and how do they drink? And that's from Ayan. I'm not sure whether they do, I'm not sure how they drink. It's a really, really good question. So they have a stomach, so they'll be able to take, they're in the ocean. So I'm not sure, do they need to drink? This is a great question. I will ask one of the experts on coral, drinking tomorrow. But that's a really great question. Thank you for that. Are there species? This is a lovely question, and looks like probably the last question we have for the day, and that is: are there species of reef animal that help corals? I'm going to use a sort of long word, interdependence, and that basically describes how lots of different animals on the reef all help each other by all doing specific roles. You might have a cleaner shrimp that might clean the mouth of a large predator. You might have a sea cucumber that hoovers along the sea floor, eating up all the dead and dying tissue that have come off other animals. You might have the coral that builds the structure on the reef. You might have a sponge. The sponge is an animal, it's just not just a sort of bathroom accessory, that filters sugars from the water and turns that into something that other animals can eat. So there's a huge amount of interdependence. So all these different parts of the reef working together. And what that means is that when we think about looking after the reef, we have to think about looking after the entire reef, and in fact other habitats such as seagrass meadows and mangroves. It's a wonderfully interconnected world, and if there is something that you want to do about looking after coral after this lesson or after the whole live event, there are probably 3 things to consider wherever you are on the planet. That's how you travel, how you eat, and how you live. So just think about how you can travel in a more sustainable way, but a more fun way. How you can eat something more sustainable that's tastier. And how, maybe because we're coming up to Thanksgiving, we're coming up to Christmas, how you can gift somebody something that maybe is an experience rather than a thing. Thank you so much for being part of this AXA Coral Live lesson all about the polyp. I hope you found the incredible edible polyp tasty. Thank you so much, and hope to see you for the rest of the week. Until then, it's goodbye for now. Bye-bye.